The snow hit her like shards of glass. Clara Bellamy's skirts whipped around her legs as she stumbled through the servants' door of Waverley Hall, the icy wind tearing at the thin fabric of her gown. She clutched the silver-edged box containing the Duchess's winter gown to her chest, teeth chattering, heart hammering. Every step across the marble floor felt like a betrayal. One slip, one glance from a footman, and her life would unravel into humiliation. And then it happened. Her foot slid on a slick patch of marble, slick with snow tracked in from the careless footman, and she fell forward, the box slipping from her grasp. Time slowed. The grand chandeliers blurred into halos of gold. Her stomach lurched as she braced for impact. A strong hand caught her mid-fall, gripping her wrist and waist with unyielding strength. She blinked up into eyes darker than a winter night, sharp as flint and colder than the snowstorm raging outside. Every breath she took seemed to catch in her throat. "You're alive," a low, commanding voice murmured. Not gentle, but not cruel. Terrifying in its intensity. She dared a glance at the man holding her, tall, impossibly broad-shouldered, clad in black velvet with a silk cravat that made him look untouchable. He was the Duke of Cavenhurst, Edward Harland Whitmore, the Devil of the North. A man whispered about in drawing-rooms, feared in every county, spoken of only in hushed tones behind gilded fans. The ballroom froze, not literally, but it felt like it. Conversations died mid-laughter. Crystal glasses wavered on silver trays. Women behind ivory fans gasped. Men straightened, jaws tight. Clara's cheeks burned hotter than the firelight, not from cold, from embarrassment, from sheer undeniable terror, from the fact that she had just collided, quite literally, into England's most feared man. Whispers curled around her ears. "The Duke! He touched a servant!" She wanted to disappear, to melt into the snowstorm outside, but he didn't let go. Not immediately. His gloved hand lingered at her waist, his other steadying her arm, and in that unbearable, suspended heartbeat, she felt something dangerous. Attention. Focus. Protection. "Careful where you tread," he said, voice low, dangerous, almost amused. "It would be a shame if someone so fragile were ruined on your first night in a hall of elegance." Clara's pulse stuttered. I was delivering a gown," she stammered, though the words sounded feeble, ridiculous. She tried to wriggle from his grip, but the strength in his hold was immovable, like an anchor dragging her into depths she wasn't ready to face. The snowstorm outside flung the doors open again, a gust of wind scattering her auburn hair across her face. Someone screamed at the noise, more whispering. And still the Duke's eyes didn't leave hers. They were storm-dark, unreadable, but something, an almost imperceptible twitch, hinted at curiosity. She could feel the scrutiny, the unspoken judgment from the crowd. Yet at the same time, she felt something else, something forbidden. A small, flickering sense of safety in the hands of the man who terrified her most. "Step back," she whispered, barely above the crackle of the fire. "I don't belong here." "You're already here," he replied. No threat, no mockery, just fact. Her heart pounded. She wanted to argue, to explain, to run, to disappear, but words failed her. Because deep down she sensed that this man, this dark, brooding Duke, was not merely a figure of gossip and fear. He carried something heavier, something sorrowful, something that mirrored the ache in her own chest. Even so, she could not let herself be caught in this dangerous gravity pulling at her. She tore her eyes away, turned to flee, only to stumble again on a trailing hem of silk someone had left behind. He caught her once more, this time by the elbow, spinning her around so she was pressed against him. Close enough that she could smell the faint trace of bergamot, sharp and bitter, mixed with the cold musk of winter. Her breath caught, not from cold, but from the closeness, the intensity, the suffocating allure. "You will not fall again," he said, almost a whisper, yet the words cut through the murmurs and music of the ball. "And if I do?" She dared, feeling a flicker of defiance despite the fear clinging to her. "Then I will catch you," he replied, eyes narrowing, serious, "every time." Her stomach lurched, not with fear, not entirely, something else, something foreign and dangerous. Desire, perhaps. A wild, terrifying pull that whispered she had stumbled into a world she could not leave, even if she tried. Moments later, the Duchess herself appeared, demanding to know why the gown had not been delivered. Clara, mortified, tried to explain, but the Duke's presence made her tongue clumsy. His gaze never left her, silently daring her to falter, and somehow silently promising she would not be harmed. The Duchess, impatient, swept past in a flurry of silk and gossip, leaving Clara flushed and trembling. She risked a glance at the Duke, expecting indifference. Instead, his eyes softened, just slightly, betraying a hint of recognition, understanding, something she couldn't name but felt prickling along her spine like frostbite. "Stay out of trouble," he said, releasing her arm, the first space she had felt since the collision. But there was weight in the words, a warning that was not solely about propriety. Yes, Your Grace," she whispered, bowing as low as she dared, cheeks flaming. She wished the ground would open beneath her. The storm outside continued unabated. Snow clung to the edges of the windows, casting a silver haze across the marble. The orchestra attempted to resume, but the undercurrent of tension lingered. Conversations circled around her and the Duke, speculation threading every polite smile. Who was she, really? What had brought her into this gilded cage? A widow with nothing but a torn gown and a fragile sense of dignity. And yet, in that room, under the Duke's impossible stare, she felt seen. Not for her social standing, not for her lack of wealth, not for the debts she carried, but simply for being. Even as she turned to move toward the servants' exit, her feet dragging with dread, she caught snippets of the whispers behind lace fans. "They say he touched her." Was that the Devil of the North? Why would he? Clara's heart pounded. She hated the attention, hated the vulnerability, yet a small, stubborn part of her couldn't deny the thrill, the dangerous, forbidden thrill of his gaze lingering, watching, claiming, even without a word. Her hand shook as she reached the door. The snowstorm outside was relentless, swirling like a living thing around her. She clutched the box of gowns tighter, wishing she could melt into the storm and disappear from the Duke's piercing eyes. And then, without warning, a gust of wind burst through the open door, stronger than before, flinging snow across the ballroom and sending the edges of her skirts flying. Clara stumbled again, unbalanced, heart leaping into her throat. Before she could fall, the Duke's hand found her again. He steadied her with an ease that was both terrifying and comforting. His eyes, dark as midnight, searched hers, unflinching. "You are reckless," he said softly, though there was no accusation, only observation. I only wanted to deliver the gown," she stammered, words tripping over one another. He did not release her. "Careful, Miss Bellamy." A shiver ran through her. Fate seems to enjoy conspiring against you tonight. From the intimacy of the moment. The way he looked at her as though she mattered, as though her life, and not her status, was important. Clara swallowed hard. Her pulse was erratic. Everything inside her screamed to run, to vanish, to retreat to the narrow safety of her London rooms, away from glances that could ruin her, and a man whose presence made her chest ache with unbidden longing. And yet, in that instant, she realized something she had never admitted to herself. Perhaps there were worse fates than being caught in the arms of the Devil of the North. She dared not speak, dared not move, dared not breathe more than necessary. And still, something about his presence wrapped around her, a dangerous, unrelenting gravity that promised her life would never be the same. The orchestra resumed, but the music was hollow, drowned beneath the storm and the unspoken tension in the room. Guests whispered, eyes darting between the Duke and the trembling seamstress, but neither moved. Time had slowed for Clara, stretched thin across the echo of a collision that would mark her forever. The Duke finally let her step back, though his hand lingered just a moment longer than propriety or fear allowed. His gaze followed her as she fled, retreating toward the servants' exit, mind a whirlwind of terror, fascination, and forbidden attraction. Outside, the snowstorm battered her, but she hardly noticed. Her heart raced not from cold, but from the memory of his touch, the power in his presence, the unspoken promise that fate had only just begun to write their story. And somewhere, deep in the echoing halls of Waverley, the devil of the north watched her disappear into the storm, and for the first time in years, felt something stir in the hollow of his heart. Have you ever met someone whose presence makes your world both safer and more dangerous at once?
Clara's hand shook as she straightened the last seam of the silk gown, the threads slipping like water between her fingers. Every stitch felt like a countdown, each one pulling her closer to the moment when the world might notice her existence, or worse, cast her aside like the scraps of fabric she often used. The candlelight flickered across the walls of her cramped London shop, throwing shadows that danced like specters, reminding her that the city outside never paused, never softened for widows or seamstresses. She was 26, though her back ached like she had lived 3 decades longer, and her eyes carried a kind of weary precision that had been carved by loss and necessity. The portraits that hung crookedly along the walls, mostly of her late husband in uniform, watched her work silently, judgmental and accusing at once. The storm raged outside, a violent symphony of wind and sleet that battered the small window panes, rattling loose shards of cold air into her bone-deep chill. Clara tugged her shawl closer, but warmth was a luxury she could rarely afford. Her mind wandered to the winter ball at Waverley Hall, the event where she had narrowly survived her literal collision with the Duke of Cavenhurst. The memory was still sharp, cutting through her nerves like a cold blade. She could recall his gloved hand gripping hers, steady and unyielding, and the brief, electric gaze that seemed to peer into the very marrow of her soul. Society had whispered about the scandal for weeks, but for Clara, the truth lingered like a ghost. She had glimpsed a man hidden behind the mask of fear and reputation, and that glimpse had shaken her in ways she could not name. From there, her thoughts drifted to her late husband, Thomas. He had been a man of valor, commissioned as a lieutenant in the campaign financed by the Duke, and his death had been both senseless and permanent. She still remembered the day the letter arrived, bearing the Duke's crest, cold, official, absolving him of any wrongdoing. And yet the cruel irony remained. Her husband had cursed the man with his dying breath. Clara had been left with the burden of debts, whispers, and a grief that wrapped around her like a thick, suffocating fog. In that moment, she understood what society demanded of women like her: invisibility, submission, survival at any cost. And yet, the Duke had changed the course of her perception, even in one fleeting collision. His reputation had been that of a man who took what he wanted and left ruin behind, a nobleman feared as the devil of the north. But his grip on her arm, firm yet gentle, had betrayed a contradiction, a man capable of restraint, honor, and perhaps even sorrow. She had no way of reconciling that image with the rumors, and worse, she was terrified of the emotions his presence had awakened. Clara's shop bell tinkled faintly as she bent to retrieve a spool of thread. The sound barely reached her ears over the storm, yet it reminded her that she was alone with her thoughts, and solitude always amplified the weight of her memories. She worked mechanically, hands moving on instinct, yet her mind wandered again, to the Duke, to Cavenhurst Manor, to the quiet intensity of his stare when she had attempted to explain herself after the fall. She could recall the subtle tension in his posture, the way he had angled his body to shield her from the prying eyes of society. A faint blush crept over her cheeks at the memory, though she chastised herself for thinking of him at all. She was a widow, a seamstress, and someone who had learned long ago that hope was a luxury reserved for others. Suddenly, a soft knock at her door pulled her from her reverie. She nearly dropped the spool, heart hammering against her ribs. Clara hesitated, peering through the narrow crack of her workshop door. Outside, a young messenger boy shivered against the wind, holding a folded note tied with a silver ribbon. Her name was scrawled on the envelope in elegant handwriting, unmistakably from Cavenhurst. She tore it open with trembling fingers, and the words inside made her blood run cold. Repair the torn hem of the Duchess's gown. Come immediately. Cavenhurst awaits. The instructions were clear, curt, and unmistakably demanding. She swallowed hard, aware that her small frame would be stepping into the lion's den once more. The snowstorm outside made the journey treacherous, yet something inside her stirred, a mixture of dread, curiosity, and an unacknowledged longing. Moments later, Clara's shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, she stepped into the sleet-laden streets. The cold bit at her cheeks and fingers, but her determination was a silent flame against the frost. She imagined the grand halls of Cavenhurst, the echoes of the winter ball, the glimmering chandeliers, and the haunted eyes of the Duke that had followed her out into the storm. What would she say to him? How could she navigate a world where every misstep could ruin not only her reputation, but also the fragile threads of trust she had begun to weave with him? By the time she arrived, snow had coated the manor in a thick blanket, muffling sound and casting a ghostly hue across the grounds. The grand front doors loomed ahead, dark and imposing, yet inviting in a way that made her heart twist with both fear and anticipation. She pushed through the doors, greeted by the familiar warmth of firelight and the subtle, musky scent of the Duke's presence lingering in the hall. Servants moved past her, eyes curious yet respectful, assuming she was a new maid. The Duke did not correct them, and Clara felt the strange, bitter sweetness of invisibility again. Edward Harland Whitmore, Duke of Cavenhurst, sat in his study, reviewing letters by the firelight. His posture was rigid, hands clasped around a silver pen, and his brow furrowed with concentration. The soft murmur of servants moving about the manor barely registered. His mind was elsewhere, haunted by the past, burdened by regrets, and yet anticipating nothing more than a quiet evening of solitude. That anticipation was interrupted by the quiet, hesitant knock of a woman at the door. "Enter," he said, voice low, measured, commanding without arrogance. Clara stepped inside, her shawl damp, her gloves stiff with cold. She curtsied instinctively, head bowed, heart hammering in her chest. The Duke's eyes met hers immediately, and for a fleeting heartbeat, the world outside ceased to exist. He saw her fully, the widow, the seamstress, the small woman who carried grief in her bones, and in her gaze he glimpsed a reflection of his own solitude and the bitterness that had long defined him. "Clara Bellamy," he said, voice threading between sternness and surprise. "It seems the storm does not spare even those who should remain unseen." Her lips parted, ready to apologize, to explain, to excuse her presence. Yet no words came. She only nodded, her eyes flicking nervously to the hem of the gown she clutched to her chest. He noticed the tremble in her hands, the shallow rise and fall of her chest, the way her breath fogged in the cold air. "Place it there," he gestured to a side table, voice softening imperceptibly. "I shall inspect the tear." Clara obeyed, every movement precise, practiced. Yet inside her mind raced. What was he thinking? Was he still the man the world whispered about? Cruel, vindictive, unyielding? Or was there something else beneath that frozen veneer? Something that the snowstorm had revealed that night at the winter ball? The Duke examined the gown, fingers brushing the delicate fabric with unexpected care. "This is exquisite," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It is a shame that beauty so rare is paired with such chaos." Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks, a strange combination of embarrassment and pride. I only wish to make it perfect for the Duchess," she whispered. "It is my duty, nothing more." "Duty," he repeated almost pensively. "It is often the cloak we wear to hide our fears." His eyes lingered on hers, sharp, perceptive, almost probing. "Tell me, Clara, do you hide yours well?" The question struck her like a jolt of cold metal. She swallowed hard, unsure how much to reveal, unsure how much he already knew. Her late husband's death, the debts, the lies, the whispered accusations about the Duke's role in that tragedy. Everything pressed against her chest like a weight she could barely bear. I try," she admitted softly, voice trembling. "But sometimes the burden is heavier than one can carry alone." For a moment, silence reigned between them. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind against the manor walls. The Duke's gaze softened, though only slightly, and for the first time, Clara saw a flicker of something human beneath his composed exterior: regret, empathy, and a deep, guarded sorrow. "Perhaps we are not so different," he said quietly. "Both bound by ghosts, both carrying what others believe we should not." Clara dared to look up fully now, meeting his eyes without flinching. In that instant, she felt the first tremor of understanding, a fragile bridge forming between two souls scarred by loss. Yet the shadow of scandal still loomed, as did the snowstorm outside, a relentless reminder that the world beyond these walls cared little for private grief. A servant knocked lightly on the door. "Your Grace, the evening meal is served." Edward gestured for her to wait, and the woman bowed, retreating. The Duke turned back to Clara, his expression unreadable. "You will remain the night, I presume? The storm? It is no friend to lone travelers." Clara hesitated, the instinct to flee warring with the strange, inexplicable trust that tugged at her chest. Her late husband had warned her never to rely on men, never to let safety feel like intimacy. And yet, the warmth of the fire, the steadiness of his presence, the echo of the winter ball collision, all of it whispered otherwise. If you insist," she murmured finally, almost against her own will. "Good," he replied, his voice softer now, but still commanding. "There is a room prepared for—"
The wind tore at the shutters like wild fingers, rattling loose the last shards of warmth in the hall, and Clara stumbled across the icy stone floor, heart pounding, breath ragged. The storm had worsened while she repaired the gown, trapping her at Cavenhurst Manor with a man whose reputation alone could kill a widow's courage. Edward Whitmore, the Duke of Cavenhurst, stood by the hearth, shadows of the firelight dancing across his solemn face. His gloved hands rested on the mantel, as if holding back the world itself. Clara froze, realizing that for the first time since the winter ball, she was truly alone with him. No servants, no distractions, no polite society to shield her from his piercing gaze. "Stay still," he said sharply, but not unkindly. "You're shivering." His eyes narrowed as he assessed her, every movement calculated, yet beneath that composure there was a current of something raw, unguarded. She could hardly respond. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, yet her feet rooted themselves to the ground, betraying her desire for safety. Edward approached slowly, each step measured. "The storm will not relent until dawn," he said, voice low, almost hypnotic. "Nor will it show mercy to those who wander unprotected." His hand reached for her arm again, not the accidental grip of the ball, but a deliberate, possessive touch that made her chest ache. Clara swallowed hard. I should leave," she whispered, though the words felt absurd even as they passed her lips. Outside, the snow lashed the windows like a living thing, and she knew she could not survive the blizzard alone. The carriage she had arrived in was gone, buried beneath the thickening drifts, and the road back to London would be a death trap. Edward's gaze softened fractionally, and he gestured toward the nearest set of stairs. "You will not leave," he stated, the authority in his tone leaving no room for argument. "You will stay until the storm passes, whether you like it or not." Her pulse spiked. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within her: fear, uncertainty, longing she dared not acknowledge. She followed him silently, shivering both from cold and from the quiet intensity of his presence. The corridors of Cavenhurst Manor stretched before her, vast and echoing, the candle sconces casting long twisting shadows that seemed to reach out for her. Each step sounded impossibly loud in the stillness, every echo a reminder of the distance she had travelled from her ordinary world of narrow streets and cramped workshops. Edward led her to a guest room, modest by the standards of nobility, but warm and lit by a fire that crackled with life. The scent of burning wood mingled with faint traces of bergamot, and Clara felt a peculiar tension. She wanted to flee, yet also to breathe in the safety that lingered despite the Duke's imposing presence. "Change into the spare garments," he said, tossing a simple nightgown onto the bed. "You cannot remain in wet silks, or you will fall ill before dawn." She hesitated, but the thought of exposure to the storm drove her to comply. In the small private space, she felt vulnerability like a second skin. As she slipped out of her damp dress, her mind replayed the collision at the winter ball, the shock of his touch, the scandal that had followed, and the unspoken understanding between them in that frozen moment. It was dangerous to dwell on those memories, yet she could not stop herself. From there, the Duke's presence was a constant looming behind the half-closed door. She could hear his measured breathing, the scrape of his boots on the floor, the faint clink of silver as he adjusted his letters by the fire. Each sound made her pulse quicken, a blend of fear and forbidden curiosity. She could not deny the magnetic pull he exerted, an invisible thread pulling her closer to a world she had been taught to avoid, one of power, danger, and unacknowledged desire. Later, as she emerged from the room, Edward was waiting, leaning against the archway of the study, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. "Sit," he commanded, though softer than before. "Warm yourself." Clara obeyed, perching on a chair with trembling hands. The firelight painted golden highlights across her pale skin, and Edward's eyes traced her face with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously exposed and seen. "You have survived storms before," he said quietly, almost conversationally, yet every word carried weight. "Loss, grief, and yet you endure." "I endure because I must," she replied, voice barely above a whisper, hiding the tremor that threatened to betray her composure. "I cannot afford weakness, not now, not ever." He studied her for a long moment. "Strength can be a mask," he said finally. "It can hide what lies underneath, and sometimes it hides too well." Clara's stomach tightened. He was speaking to her, yes, but also to something deeper, the part of herself that still longed for connection, for trust, for understanding. Her eyes flicked to his, and she saw in them the same shadow she carried: guilt, loss, and the unbearable weight of truths left unspoken. The storm howled outside, and in the vast candle-lit study the world shrank to just the two of them. Edward moved closer, carefully, as if testing the boundaries of propriety and of her patience. "Tell me," he said, voice low, "what do you fear most?" Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to say the obvious, that she feared losing herself, her shop, her reputation. But the truth was more profound, more dangerous. "I fear that no matter how carefully I navigate this world, I will be swept away by forces beyond my control," she admitted, each word trembling with honesty. "I fear that my life will be defined not by who I am, but by the mistakes and sins of others." His gaze did not waver. "And yet," he said, "you are here. You are not fleeing. You are not hiding. You are standing in a world that would rather see you vanish, and you endure." The weight of his words pressed into her chest like ice and fire at once. She wanted to run, to escape the intimacy of his understanding, yet she could not. "Why do you understand me?" she asked, barely audible. Edward's jaw tightened. "Because I have known loss," he said simply. "Because I have been judged, misunderstood, blamed for things I did not do, because I carry ghosts, just as you do." For the first time, Clara allowed herself to meet his gaze fully, and she saw the truth in him, the man beneath the fearsome reputation. The haunted Duke, the devil of the North, the man whispered about in salons and gossip columns, was human, flawed, burdened, and fiercely loyal beneath the ice of his public persona. The clock ticked slowly, each chime a reminder that the night was deep, the storm relentless. Clara shifted in her chair, feeling the tension of the day and of the encounter, coiling tight within her. She longed to speak, to confess something, anything, to bridge the invisible gap between them, yet the words died on her lips. Edward moved closer, standing behind her chair. His presence was a warm shadow, a force that pressed against her senses and made her heart beat uneven. "You will stay the night in safety," he said, voice quiet but firm. "You will not face the storm alone, and neither will you face your burdens alone, if you are willing to trust me." She swallowed hard, the enormity of his offer pressing into her chest. The idea of trust felt foreign, dangerous, and exhilarating all at once. I will stay," she whispered, the words tasting like both defiance and surrender. A sudden knock at the study door startled them both. The sound echoed in the room like a warning bell. Edward's head snapped toward the door, eyes narrowing. "Who comes at this hour?" he demanded, voice taut with caution. The door opened to reveal a young footman trembling from the cold. "Your Grace, a letter, sir. From London." Edward's brow furrowed. He took the envelope, breaking the seal with deliberate care. As he read, his eyes darkened, storm clouds forming behind the calm exterior. Clara watched him, heart hammering. She had expected tension, perhaps anger, but the depth of his reaction startled her, and in some unspoken way it terrified her. "The letter mentions your father," Edward said, voice low, cutting through the warmth of the study. "It implies that your family may have played a role in the events that led to my ruin." Clara's stomach dropped. She had known the letter might arrive, that her past and her father's sins could collide with the fragile trust forming here. Yet hearing it aloud, from his lips, made it a living, breathing threat. I did not know," she stammered, panic rising. "I swear I never—" Edward held up a hand, stopping her mid-plea. "I do not yet know the truth," he said, voice measured. "But every secret has a weight, and soon we may both find ours unbearable." The fire crackled, shadows dancing across the walls, echoing the turbulence in both their hearts. Clara swallowed again, feeling the first real tremor of fear mixed with something she did not expect, anticipation. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, but within the walls of Cavenhurst Manor, a storm of a different kind raged, unspoken truths, fragile trust, and the stirrings of forbidden connection. Edward finally broke the silence. "You should rest," he said quietly, "for the night is long, and the morrow will demand more than either of us are ready to give." Clara nodded, her limbs heavy with exhaustion and tension. She moved to the guest room, every step echoing in the vast halls. Behind her, the Duke remained in the study, letters clutched in one hand, the other resting on the mantel, lost in thought. Both were prisoners of circumstance and storm, of the past and the secrets that bound them. In the quiet of her room, Clara sat by the window, watching the snow swirl like silver ghosts against the blackened sky. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart. The memory of the winter ball, the collision, and the Duke's intense gaze lingered like a spark refusing to die. The letter, Edward's words, the storm outside, all of it threatened to crush her, yet also ignited something dangerous and exhilarating, the possibility of connection, the first flicker of hope in years of solitude and fear. Outside, the wind howled, relentless and untamed. Inside, two hearts beat cautiously, tethered by unspoken understanding, and the weight of secrets yet to be revealed. For the first time since the winter ball, Clara felt that her life had shifted, irrevocably, dangerously, beautifully, and somewhere deep within her the seed of courage began to take root.
The first note of the piano cut through the silence of the library like a blade, sharp and trembling, and Clara froze mid-step. Edward's fingers hovered above the keys, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the fire as though it held the answers he refused to seek elsewhere. The storm outside had not relented. Its fury rattled the windows, snow drumming against the panes with relentless insistence. But inside Cavenhurst Manor, a different storm brewed, a collision of grief, guilt, and the fragile stirrings of desire that neither dared to name. Clara's breath caught. She had come to deliver a repaired hem for the Duke's personal coat, yet somehow her hands trembled at the sight of him so exposed, so human, before the roaring hearth and the instrument that held more of his soul than any court or salon ever could. I didn't mean to interrupt, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward's head lifted, and for a moment his gaze pinned her to the spot. The intensity of it made her chest ache, a sensation she had not anticipated. "You do not interrupt," he said, voice low, almost bitter. "I invited no one into this sanctuary, yet somehow fate has brought you here." She hesitated, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. Every instinct screamed at her to keep her distance, yet every heartbeat pulled her closer. The memory of their first collision at the winter ball surged like fire through her veins, and she realized with a shock that she had been holding herself back, not from fear alone, but from something far more dangerous, the promise of connection. Edward's hands finally descended on the keys, and the music poured forth, a haunting melody that spoke of loss and longing, of winters endured alone and hearts buried beneath ice. Clara could not move. She could only listen, each note striking a chord deep within her. She saw him not as the feared Duke, not as the devil of the North whispered about in salons, but as a man shattered by circumstance, a man who had loved and lost, whose pride had been weaponized against him, and whose solitude was both armor and prison. Moments later, he stopped abruptly, the final chord hanging in the air like a question unanswered. He rose, stepping toward her with deliberate care. "You should not linger in my family's affairs," he said, but the words carried a weight that suggested otherwise. "Yet here you are, always in the orbit of consequences that are not your own." Clara's throat tightened. I only wish to do my work," she whispered, though she knew her voice faltered under the gravity of his gaze. "I do not seek to meddle in matters that are none of my concern." He studied her, the flickering firelight illuminating the sharp planes of his face, the tension coiled in his shoulders. "And yet, every choice you make, every step you take, draws you closer to truths that could destroy you." His voice softened slightly. "Or save you. That is the paradox of this house, and of your presence here," she swallowed, heart hammering. "I do not know which I would rather face, the danger or the truth," she admitted, her voice trembling with honesty. Edward's gaze softened, just a fraction, and he extended a gloved hand toward her. "Then let us face them together," he said quietly, the command tempered by an invitation, a plea wrapped in the authority that defined him. "At least for tonight, you will not endure this alone." Clara's pulse raced. Her hand hovered near his, almost touching, almost retreating. The tension between them was electric, fragile as crystal and yet as undeniable as the snowstorm that pressed against the manor walls. She knew that a single misstep could shatter everything, her dignity, her hope, her very heart. But some reckless part of her longed to bridge the distance, to let him see her not as a seamstress or a widow, but as someone capable of understanding, of empathy, of love. Edward guided her toward a small table by the hearth, where steaming cups of tea waited. The aroma of bergamot mingled with the faint scent of the storm creeping through the slightly ajar windows. "Sit," he instructed, though his voice lacked the earlier sharpness. "We will speak, if only to prevent the silence from suffocating us." As she settled into the chair, the warmth seeping through her chilled bones, Edward moved to stand behind her, fingers resting lightly on the back of the seat. His proximity was unbearable and exhilarating all at once. "Tell me of London," he said, a deliberate change in topic, as if seeking to navigate safer waters while still probing for understanding. Clara hesitated, then found herself speaking of narrow alleys, of crowded markets, of the smells of wet cobblestones and fresh-baked bread mingling in the early morning. She spoke of her shop, her late husband's uniforms, the silent grief that had shadowed her every step. With each word, Edward listened, unflinching, absorbing her life into his world of grandeur and shadowed corridors. "And yet," he said finally after a long silence, "you endure." His eyes bore into hers, searching, questioning. "You endure while carrying the weight of those who failed you. And still, you come here." Clara's fingers clenched the cup, knuckles white. "Because there is nowhere else to hide," she confessed, "and perhaps because I hoped someone might understand." Edward's expression softened, a flicker of vulnerability crossing his features before it was buried beneath the usual mask of controlled stoicism. "Then perhaps, in your endurance, there is courage that even I cannot feign." The wind shrieked against the windows, a reminder that the storm had no mercy, that the night was long and fraught with uncertainty. Yet within the walls of the study, a different storm raged, a storm of glances that lingered too long, of unspoken words, of emotions carefully suppressed. Clara felt it all, the tension, the danger, the thrill of proximity, and the ache of connection she dared not fully acknowledge. Then came a knock at the door, hesitant but insistent, and Edward's jaw tightened. "Enter," he commanded, though the hardness in his tone belied the storm of his thoughts. The door opened to reveal the Duke's steward, carrying a tray of letters. The mundane intrusion felt almost violent, an interruption to the delicate balance between them. Edward accepted the letters without a word, eyes flicking over the seals with meticulous scrutiny. He set them aside, finally turning to Clara with a sharpness that belied his earlier gentleness. "Your presence here is no longer a simple coincidence," he said. "I see that the threads of fate are more entangled than I allowed myself to believe." Clara's heart pounded. She began, but Edward cut her off. "No explanations," he said, voice low, tense. "Not yet. We have other matters that demand our attention." He moved toward the grand window, pulling aside the velvet drapes to reveal the night outside. Snow swirled violently, the moonlight glinting off icy drifts. The wind howled like the ghosts of the past, and Clara felt her chest tighten. The storm was not merely a barrier, it was a mirror, reflecting the turmoil and uncertainty that threatened to undo them both. Edward turned, his silhouette framed by the firelight, and for a fleeting moment, Clara saw the man beneath the titles, the gossip, the fearsome reputation. He was human, vulnerable, yet unyielding. "There will be a visitor tomorrow," he said, breaking the silence. "A reminder that the past we wish buried never truly stays hidden." Her stomach twisted. She knew what he meant. Lord Pembroke, the rival nobleman who had been a shadow over the Duke's name, a force of malice and scandal. And now his presence threatened to unravel the fragile connection forming between them. Clara's fingers trembled around her teacup. I will be careful," she whispered, though even she doubted whether caution could preserve the fragile peace of the night. Edward approached her once more, placing a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Careful is not enough," he said, voice softening. "You must be brave, braver than you believe, for the threads of this night, and the nights to come, will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine." The storm outside intensified, snow lashing the windows, wind howling like a chorus of unseen voices. Inside, the room was alive with tension, desire, and unspoken truths. Clara felt herself teetering on the precipice of fear and longing, aware that every heartbeat, every glance, every small gesture carried weight far beyond the walls of the study. Edward finally moved to the piano again, his hands resting lightly on the keys, not playing, but as if drawing strength from the instrument itself. "Rest now," he said quietly. "Tomorrow brings revelations we cannot ignore, but tonight, we endure." Clara nodded, moving toward the guest room, heart still racing. Each step echoed in the vast halls, a reminder that she was both intruder and participant in a world that was dangerous, intoxicating, and achingly human. The snow continued its relentless assault outside, yet within, two hearts navigated the treacherous waters of trust, desire, and the promise of connection. Before she closed the door, she turned briefly, catching Edward's gaze. In that look, she saw the storm mirrored, tumultuous, uncertain, yet alive with possibility. She dared not hope, dared not dream, yet deep within, a fragile spark of courage and longing took root. The night pressed on, the wind shrieking like the voice of fate itself, and Clara understood, with a mix of terror and exhilaration, that nothing would ever be the same. Cavenhurst Manor, the Duke, the storm, they were all entwined with her destiny now, threads she could neither sever nor ignore. And somewhere in the shadows of the study, Edward Whitmore, Duke of Cavenhurst, felt the same inescapable pull, the same quiet, undeniable truth. The widow who had stumbled into his life was no accident. She was a catalyst, a mirror, and perhaps the first step toward thawing the winter he had buried his soul beneath. The storm outside continued, merciless and wild, as inside, the quiet fires of trust, longing, and danger blazed brighter than any candle. And for Clara Bellamy, that night marked the beginning of a journey she could neither predict nor control, but one that promised heartbreak, revelation, and, if courage prevailed, love. She closed her eyes, heart hammering, and wondered, could she survive the storm within as she had survived the storm without? Could she navigate the treacherous corridors of a duke's heart, haunted by ghosts and shadows, and find a place for herself amidst the ruins? Tomorrow would bring answers. Tonight, only the firelight, the music, and the silence bore witness to the fragile, dangerous, exhilarating connection that had begun to take root between them. And somewhere in the storm-lashed halls of Cavenhurst Manor, fate waited with bated breath, ready to test them both. The sharp crack of the letter hitting the polished oak floor echoed through the dining hall, silencing the murmurs and clinking glasses. Clara froze, her heart hammering so violently she feared it might betray her secret before she could think. All eyes were on her, and at the center of that storm was Edward, his expression unreadable, a tempest contained beneath the mask of a duke. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to witness her undoing. Clara's hand shook as she bent to retrieve the parchment, knowing every movement spelled danger. The letter, slipped carelessly into her bag earlier, now lay exposed, the Duke's name and her father's scandal intertwined in ink that would not forgive. She could feel the weight of betrayal pressing against her chest, suffocating her. She had hoped, prayed even, that the truth would remain buried, that Edward's icy walls and her careful discretion would protect them both. But fate, relentless as the winter storms of Cavenhurst, had other plans. Edward's gaze pinned her. It was not just disappointment she saw there, but something more primal. Hurt, disbelief, and a betrayal that cut deeper than any sword. "You knew," he said, his voice a low growl that reverberated through her very bones. "All this time, you knew who I was, and you let me trust you?" Clara's lips trembled. She wanted to speak, to explain, to tell him that she had feared for both their hearts. that she had tried to protect him from the shame and herself from the consequences. But words failed her. They always did when the stakes were this high, when the chasm between truth and love yawned wide and threatening. I didn't mean... You didn't mean? Edward's laugh was sharp, brittle, like ice cracking underfoot. Do you understand what your silence has cost me? Do you understand the years I've lived under the weight of lies, branded a devil, haunted by losses that were never mine alone? His voice rose, carrying across the grand hall, stopping all conversation. Every guest's gaze lingered, some in shock, others in intrigue, all unwilling to look away from the spectacle of a duke laid bare by betrayal. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She had imagined this confrontation countless times in the quiet of her shop, in the stillness of her lonely nights, but never like this. Never with the grandeur and severity of the winter ball, the eyes of society upon them, and Edward's hurt magnified by all that was at stake. I tried to protect you, to protect us, she whispered, her voice fragile, almost drowned beneath the storm outside and the storm within. Edward took a step closer, and Clara felt the heat of him, the proximity of power and heartache mingling in a dangerous blend. Protect me? You call secrecy protection? His hands clenched at his sides, knuckles white beneath the gloves. Do you not see, Clara? By hiding the truth, you have done what my enemies could not. You have placed me at the mercy of my past, of this society, and of your own family's sins. The room seemed to tilt, a dizzying combination of music, whispers, and the faint scent of bergamot and waxed wood assaulting Clara's senses. She felt small, exposed, yet the ache in her chest told her she could not retreat. Not now. Not when the thread between them, fragile and fraying, demanded courage. I didn't know how, she confessed, tears spilling freely now. I didn't know how to tell you without destroying everything. I was afraid you would hate me, that you would leave. That? Edward's voice softened slightly, betraying the storm of emotion roiling inside him. He stepped closer still, bridging the distance that had always been fraught with tension, desire, and unspoken longing. That I might stop seeing you as someone worth trusting? He asked, voice breaking just enough to reveal the vulnerability beneath the Duke's facade. Do you not see, Clara, that trust is all I have left? That love, if it ever existed, is forged in the fragile light of truth? Clara's hands clutched the letter, torn between throwing it away and confessing every fear, every sorrow, every fragment of truth she had buried beneath careful deception. I do see, she said finally, voice steadier now, though trembling still. And I am sorry. More than I can say. I wanted to tell you, but I didn't know how to carry the weight of both our pasts. Edward's jaw tightened. He moved toward the window, pulling aside the velvet drapes to peer into the night, the storm casting ghostly patterns of shadow and light across his stern features. Our pasts, he repeated, voice low, almost to himself. Perhaps that is all we have. Perhaps that is all that ever defines us. And yet, I wonder, can we survive knowing everything? The room felt colder, though the fire blazed high in the hearth, the flickering flames reflecting the tumult within Edward's soul. Clara's heart ached at the sight, recognizing the man she had come to care for, the man beneath the Duke, the man who had suffered at the hands of lies, betrayal, and society's cruelty. We can, she whispered, taking a tentative step toward him. If we are honest, if we face it together, we can survive, Edward, if you let me help. He turned slowly, eyes searching hers, searching for the courage, the truth, the proof that she meant what she said. The silence between them stretched, weighted with possibility and peril. You would stand by me, knowing all that you have hidden? His voice was a mixture of disbelief and yearning, fragile as glass, yet edged with the steel of his pride. Clara nodded, tears blurring her vision. "I would," she said firmly, though her voice wavered with emotion. "Because I do not want to live in fear. I do not want to hide from love or from life any longer. I choose truth. I choose us." Edward's expression softened, tension giving way to a flicker of hope, though shadowed by the wounds of the past. "You are brave," he murmured, voice low, almost reverent. "Braver than I have ever known, and perhaps in that courage there is a chance for redemption, for both of us." Clara's lips quivered, hope mingling with fear. The storm outside had not ceased, yet inside, a fragile calm began to take root. She dared to believe that trust, however tentative, could form a bridge across the chasm of lies, betrayal, and sorrow. "Then we face it," she said softly, reaching for his hand, her fingers brushing against the leather glove. "Together." Edward's hand closed over hers, firm yet gentle, grounding them both in the moment. "Together," he echoed, voice barely above a whisper, carrying the weight of unspoken promises and the tentative spark of something fragile and profound. The sound of murmurs and whispered gossip began to rise again in the hall, but neither of them noticed. The world had contracted to the space between them, to the warmth of the fire, the tremor of trust, and the fragile, flickering possibility of love. Clara's gaze met Edward's, and for the first time since the storm had trapped her in this house, she felt seen, not as a widow, not as a seamstress, not as a bearer of secrets, but as someone who mattered, someone who could stand beside him, face the world, and perhaps, finally, find peace amidst the ruins of past betrayals. Edward's thumb brushed lightly against the back of her hand, a tentative gesture loaded with unspoken promise. "You have no idea," he said, voice husky, "what it means to have someone who dares to see me as I am, and not as the world demands I be." Clara swallowed hard, chest tight with emotion. "Then do not waste it," she whispered. "Do not waste this moment, this chance. We cannot undo the past, but we can choose what comes next." A sudden crash from the kitchen made them both startle, reminding them that the world outside the library, outside Cavenhurst, and outside their fragile bubble of trust, still existed with all its pressures and prying eyes. Edward exhaled sharply, releasing a fraction of the tension that had built in his shoulders. "Yes," he said, voice steadier now. "What comes next? We face it. And perhaps, for the first time, we face it together without fear." Clara's hand tightened around his. The warmth of his touch, the steady presence of his body, the quiet strength that had drawn her in from the beginning, they all conspired to give her courage. "Together," she echoed, letting the word resonate through the room, through her heart, through the very marrow of her being. The fire crackled and the storm outside intensified, as if nature itself acknowledged the tumult within these walls. Yet within the library, a fragile light persisted, a beacon of hope, of trust, and of the dangerous, exhilarating beginnings of love. Edward lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a fleeting kiss to her knuckles, a silent vow of protection, understanding, and tentative forgiveness. Clara's breath hitched, a shiver running through her despite the warmth of the hearth. It was a touch that carried centuries of longing, sorrow, and redemption condensed into a single trembling gesture. She looked up at him, searching for the man beyond the title, the whispers, the fear. "I believe in us," she said softly, her voice a fragile thread of conviction. "Even if the world does not." Edward's gaze held hers, unwavering, and for the first time in years, the Duke of Cavenhurst felt the possibility of light breaking through the frost that had encased his soul. "Then we begin," he murmured, "with truth, with courage, with what remains of us." Clara nodded, a sense of resolve settling over her. She knew the road ahead would be perilous, fraught with scandal, exposure, and the ever-present threat of Lord Pembroke's schemes. Yet in this moment, the choice was clear. She would stand beside him, and together they would confront the past, whatever it held, whatever it threatened to destroy. The snowstorm raged outside, indifferent and merciless, but inside the manor, a new force stirred, one born of courage, honesty, and the fragile, flickering promise of redemption and love. Clara drew in a shaky breath, letting the warmth of the fire, the steadiness of Edward's presence, and the quiet strength of her own resolve anchor her against the chaos. And somewhere, in the shadows of the great dining hall, Lord Pembroke's name lingered, a spectre, a challenge, a threat. But for the first time, Clara no longer felt powerless. She had faced the storm within herself, had confessed, had chosen truth over fear, and in doing so, had planted the seeds of hope amidst the ruins of betrayal. Edward's fingers brushed hers again, a subtle affirmation of trust, of tentative forgiveness, of what might yet bloom between them if they dared. The Duke of Cavenhurst, once a man imprisoned by the sins of others, now faced a choice: to succumb to the bitterness that had defined him, or to step into the fragile, terrifying light that Clara had offered. And for Clara, the choice had been made the moment she stepped into his life: to fight for love, to fight for trust, to fight for a future neither of them could yet see, but both could feel stirring in the marrow of their hearts. The storm outside roared, relentless and wild, but inside, a different storm had passed. In its wake, the quiet embers of trust and love glowed, fragile yet defiant, ready to face whatever revelations, betrayals, or challenges the coming days would bring. Clara exhaled slowly, heart still racing, and whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "We will survive this. Somehow, we will survive together." Edward's eyes met hers, unflinching, steady, and for the first time the impossible weight of the past felt a little lighter. "Together," he repeated, sealing the promise with the weight of a man who had known loss, grief, and betrayal, yet dared to hope for redemption and love. Outside, the snow fell in relentless sheets. Inside, Cavenhurst Manor held its breath, poised on the brink of scandal, revelation, and the tumultuous path toward a winter redemption neither had yet dared to imagine. And somewhere in that stillness, the fragile threads of trust and desire intertwined, ready to be tested, torn, and reforged into something stronger than either of them had ever known. The silence of Cavenhurst Manor was broken by the sharp crack of the study door slamming, echoing through the empty corridors like a gunshot. Edward stood rigid, back to the fire, the shadows casting angular lines across his face, every muscle taut with fury and grief. Weeks had passed since Clara's departure, yet her absence pressed down on him heavier than any scandal, any whisper, any frostbitten night. The house felt hollow, haunted not by spirits, but by the weight of what had been lost, by the hollow ache of words left unsaid. Clara's chair remained empty across from him, the teacup she had set down on the edge of the desk gathering dust. He could still see the curve of her lips, the tremble of her hands, the faint scent of lavender that lingered like a ghost in the cold, cavernous study. Every corner of the manor mocked him with her absence. Every crackling fire whispered her name. He had expected anger, betrayal, maybe even relief when she left, but the truth was far worse. He felt hollow, undone, trapped in a silence that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. In London, Clara sat in her tiny, threadbare shop, the shutters rattling in the wind, her fingers poised over a half-finished gown. The city felt colder than the snow-laden roads of Cavenhurst. Every step she took weighed down by guilt and fear. Word of the scandal had spread like wildfire. Her father's involvement had been twisted by Pembroke's manipulations. Customers whispered behind hands, friends avoided her, and her livelihood began to crumble. Her hands, skilled and delicate, shook as she folded silks and lace, each fold a reminder of the life she had lost and the man she had left behind. She penned a letter, carefully choosing her words, but each sentence seemed inadequate, a feeble attempt to bridge the chasm she had left in Edward's heart. "If forgiveness is beyond us," she wrote, "let mercy not be. And if love is lost, let it be remembered as courage, not regret." She folded the letter, pressed a tear into the crease, and set it aside, too afraid to send it, too afraid to face his wrath, or worse, his cold indifference. Meanwhile, Edward paced the long corridors of Cavenhurst, the echo of his boots like the ticking of a merciless clock. Every portrait, every tapestry, every gilded frame seemed to mock him with the memory of Clara's soft laughter, the warmth she had brought into rooms he had long abandoned to frost and shadow. Pembroke's name lingered in every conversation he overheard, every whispered threat from lawyers and neighbors. The man's ambition, his manipulations, and his cruelty had stretched like a dark spiderweb across both their lives. Yet Edward felt powerless, not against Pembroke's schemes, but against the absence of the one woman who could thaw the winter in his heart. That night, he stood by the frost-covered window in his private study, watching the snow swirl like a river of white between the dark silhouettes of the manor's spires. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within him, relentless, blinding, and full of danger. His mind replayed every word Clara had said, every glance they had shared, every fleeting touch. And then, inevitably, it returned to the accusation that had driven her away. Her father, his past, the betrayal that had poisoned trust before it could root. "Why did you leave?" he whispered into the empty room, voice hoarse, raw. "Was it the truth or the fear? And do you even know what you left behind?" The walls held no answer. The fire offered no solace. Only the cold gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving, a reminder that love left unattended could die even in the heart of the bravest man. Clara, too, wrestled with her demons. She could feel Pembroke's influence creeping into every corner of her world, each lie about her father's guilt spreading through London society. Her fingers traced the worn edges of a portrait of her late husband, imagining the path that could have been had she not been bound by fear. Memories collided with present reality. The winter ball, the storm, Edward's gloved hand steadying her, the warmth that had ignited something she had long believed extinguished. The letter remained unsent, but it haunted her, just as Edward haunted him. She knew she could not rebuild her life without confronting the storm head-on, and so she resolved to journey back to Cavenhurst, to face the consequences, to protect the man who had, without realizing it, protected her heart from itself. At the same time, Edward received word from his solicitor. Pembroke had filed new claims, threatening the estate, exploiting the scandal, and forcing Edward into a corner. The Duke's control, the pride and discipline that had been his shield, faltered under the combined weight of societal scorn and legal pressure. He roared in frustration, slamming his fist into the oak desk, splinters jumping like sparks into the firelight. The walls, once witnesses to his composed solitude, now felt like cages, closing in with the inevitability of defeat. And yet, even in the dark of despair, Edward's thoughts returned, unbidden, to Clara. The woman who had dared to step into his life, to see past the title, to offer compassion when the world offered judgment. She had left, but the ember she had lit refused to die, and with it came the realization: if he was to survive Pembroke's schemes, if he was to reclaim his honor, he would need her courage as much as his own. Hours passed. The snow continued its relentless descent, draping the manor in white silence. Edward moved through the hallways like a shadow, restless and haunted. He opened the study door again, staring at the empty chair, the untouched papers, the faint scent of lavender. Every tick of the grandfather clock mocked him, a reminder of time lost, opportunities squandered, and the fragile trust he had allowed to shatter. Clara, in London, finally made her decision. She packed documents, letters, and proof of Pembroke's deceit into a small satchel. Her fingers lingered over the silk gloves she had worn at the winter ball, a talisman of courage and memory. The wind howled against the window panes, rattling the fragile panes like the beating of a frantic heart. She closed the shutters, donned her cloak, and stepped into the night. Snowflakes whipped against her face, a painful reminder of how far she had fallen from safety, but also of the path she was determined to follow. Each step toward Cavenhurst felt like a trial, each gust of wind a reminder of the risks, yet each heartbeat propelled her forward. She thought of Edward, of the trust she had nearly destroyed, of the warmth she had left behind. She thought of Pembroke, of the lies, the manipulation, the way his presence had poisoned both their lives. And she thought of herself, of the courage she had summoned from despair and the love she had refused to abandon. Edward, pacing the library once more, paused as if sensing her approach across the miles and through the storm. The fire flickered, casting shadows that danced across his stern face, reflecting a mixture of fear, hope, and the raw ache of longing. He could not know she was coming, could not anticipate the bravery that would bridge the distance between them. Yet instinctively, he felt the shift, the invisible tether pulling tighter across the snow, across the darkened roads, toward him. Clara trudged through knee-deep snow, the storm merciless, every step a battle of will and endurance. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, gloves damp with frost, hair plastered to her face. And still, she pressed on, driven by necessity, by love, by the knowledge that some risks, some truths, could no longer be avoided. By the time she reached the gates of Cavenhurst, exhaustion threatened to unseat her resolve. Her legs quivered, her lungs burned, and the wind cut through the layers of her cloak, as though determined to drive her back. But the manor loomed ahead, a fortress of stone and shadow, holding both peril and salvation within its walls. She gathered what remained of her strength, lifted her hand to knock, and hesitated, questioning for a fleeting moment whether she had the courage to face him. The door swung open before her could summon another breath, and Edward stood there, tall, formidable, yet with an unmistakable glimmer of hope breaking through his guarded exterior. His eyes, wide and searching, took in the snow-soaked seamstress who had dared to return, carrying the weight of truth, courage, and the fragile possibility of redemption. "Clara," he breathed, voice a mixture of disbelief, relief, and restrained emotion. You came back." "I had to," she said, shivering, yet standing straighter than she had in weeks. "The truth, the lies, Pembroke, it cannot stand, and neither can we." Edward's hand hovered, unsure, torn between pulling her inside, shielding her, and fearing the storm had hardened her resolve beyond reconciliation. He saw the fire in her eyes, the trembling strength in her stance, and something in him shifted, a thaw, hesitant yet undeniable. "Then come in," he said finally, voice low, carrying the authority of a duke and the vulnerability of a man who had almost lost everything. "We face this together." Clara stepped over the threshold, snow falling from her cloak, leaving traces of winter along the marble floors. The manor seemed to exhale, the storm outside pressing against the walls. Yet inside, a fragile warmth began to settle. The distance of weeks collapsed into shared purpose, a bond reforged in adversity, ready to confront the machinations of Pembroke, the lingering ghosts of past betrayals, and the fragile threads of trust they would need to rebuild together. And as the door closed behind her with a definitive click, Edward finally allowed himself to release the breath he had been holding for weeks. Their eyes met, not with accusation or fear, but with tentative hope. Between them, unspoken yet palpable, existed the possibility of redemption, of courage, and of love surviving even the harshest winter storms. The night stretched before them, long and uncertain, yet neither flinched. For in the darkest hour they had found each other, clinging not to the past, but to the fragile promise that, together, they might just endure. Outside, the snow continued to fall, relentless and cold. Inside, Cavenhurst Manor held its breath, poised on the precipice of revelation, justice, and the long path toward a winter redemption that neither had dared hope for, until now. And somewhere in the quiet, broken walls of the Duke's study, a single thought took root in both their hearts. They were not defeated. They were not alone. And whatever storm awaited them next, they would face it, together. The wind tore through the trees like a living thing, shrieking against the stone walls of Cavenhurst, as Clara trudged forward, each step a battle against the relentless storm. Snowflakes stung her cheeks, soaked her cloak, and froze her gloves into useless weight, yet she pressed on, driven by a single, unyielding thought: Edward. She had left him to the silence, to the bitter loneliness of his own despair, and she would not, could not, let Pembroke's lies and schemes destroy him completely. Her boots sank deep into the snow with every step, muscles screaming in protest, lungs burning with cold and exhaustion. Memories collided in her mind, his gloved hand steadying her at the winter ball, the firelight in the library reflecting the warmth she had glimpsed in his eyes, the moments of quiet vulnerability when he had let his guard slip. She had almost allowed fear to bind her heart, almost let pride prevent her from returning, but the truth had clawed its way through the layers of hesitation. The Duke needed her, and she could not abandon him again. Inside the manor, Edward paced the long corridor outside the library, hands clenching into fists at his sides. Every minute she remained absent was another dagger to his chest, another proof that the world had conspired against them. Weeks of silence had only heightened his anxiety, each creaking floorboard, each hiss of wind through the cracks, a cruel reminder that he was powerless to protect her, or himself. Pembroke's schemes were advancing, the legal notices piling up like snowdrifts, threatening to bury them both. And yet, in his heart, he still clung to the fragile ember of hope that Clara might return, might bring the clarity and courage he so desperately needed. Suddenly, the front door burst open, snow and ice spilling into the grand hall like a tidal wave. Edward spun, heart leaping, and there she was, Clara, shivering, soaked, determined, and alive. Her eyes wide with cold and resolve, locked onto his, and the world outside ceased to exist. She had returned, carrying truth, courage, and the possibility of salvation for them both. "Clara!" he exclaimed, his voice breaking as he crossed the hall in long, swift strides, hands reaching for hers. "You... how... why?" Words tumbled, chaotic and unrefined, unable to contain the surge of relief, disbelief, and longing. "I came back," she said, voice trembling but firm, "because we cannot let Pembroke win. The truth must be seen, and—" she faltered, shivering violently, "and you must not bear this alone." He pulled her inside, closing the door against the storm, snowflakes clinging to her hair and cloak. The fire in the hall cast a warm glow over her pale, determined face, highlighting the determination etched in her features. For the first time in weeks, Edward felt a sense of possibility, fragile but insistent. She had returned not as a frightened seamstress, but as a force of courage, unafraid of the storm inside or outside. As they moved to the study, Clara produced the bundle of documents and letters she had risked everything to retrieve. Proof of Pembroke's deceit, evidence of her father's innocence, and the intricate web of lies that had ensnared them both. She laid them out carefully on the oak desk, fingers trembling not from the cold alone, but from the intensity of the moment. Edward's eyes scanned the papers, disbelief giving way to shock, then to a slow, simmering rage. "All this time, all the pieces were here," he muttered, voice low and harsh. "And yet we suffered, she suffered, because of his lies. His hand clenched into a fist, striking the desk. Splinters jumped, catching in the firelight. Pembroke will pay for this. Clara reached for his hand, guiding it down, her touch steadying. Together, Edward. We face him together. The storm outside, it is nothing compared to what we can endure united. Her eyes, glistening with tears, held his gaze with unwavering resolve. The storm raged on, relentless, but inside the manor, a different kind of battle had begun. Edward and Clara worked through the night, crafting their plan to expose Pembroke, using both courage and cunning. Their proximity reignited the intimacy that had been suspended by betrayal and distance. Every glance, every brush of fingers, every shared breath, a reminder of what they had risked and what they stood to regain. Hours passed, and the first hints of dawn touched the sky with muted light. Snowflakes clung to the windows, yet inside, the warmth of the fire mirrored the growing certainty between them. Edward allowed himself a rare smile, tentative yet genuine, as Clara handed him the final piece of evidence, a ledger proving Pembroke's manipulation, his greed, and his attempt to destroy both their reputations. "Are you ready?" she asked, voice soft yet resolute. "Once we step into that ballroom, there is no turning back. Pembroke will see everything, and we will see if the world chooses truth over gossip, love over lies." Edward's gaze softened, fingers brushing hers in a silent promise. "I am ready, because you are here. You have returned, and with you, hope returns to Cavenhurst." The words were simple, but laden with emotion, a confession of trust, of relief, of longing restrained for far too long. They waited until the manor was quiet, servants gone to their chambers, the corridors hushed, save for the distant hiss of the wind. Then together, they made their way to the ballroom, where their story had begun, where their collision had sparked everything, and where justice would finally be served. The doors swung open, revealing a gathering of lords, ladies, and curious onlookers. Whispers rippled like silk across the polished floors, glances darting to the Duke and the seamstress, who dared return. Clara stepped forward, head held high, nerves steadied by resolve. Edward followed, regal and imposing, yet his eyes never left hers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clara began, voice steady despite the tremor of anticipation, "for too long, you have believed lies. You have believed scandal over truth, gossip over evidence. Today, the truth will be revealed, and no man, not even Lord Pembroke, can hide it." She produced the ledger, holding it aloft. Murmurs escalated into shocked gasps as she detailed Pembroke's machinations, the false claims, the manipulated letters, the deliberate obfuscation that had nearly destroyed them all. Edward added his voice, corroborating her statements, his presence lending authority and weight to every word. Pembroke, seated with an air of arrogance, stiffened as the accusations mounted. The room's attention turned, eyes flickering between Clara, Edward, and the mounting evidence. The power dynamic shifted palpably. The Duke and the seamstress were no longer the vulnerable victims of rumor, but the arbiters of truth. "You," Edward's voice cut through the murmurs, sharp and commanding, "have slandered, deceived, and sought to destroy what is not yours to claim. And for what? Greed, power, vanity?" His gaze, piercing and unrelenting, fixed on Pembroke. "Your schemes end tonight." Clara, emboldened, stepped closer, the firelight catching in her eyes. "The truth is not just in these papers," she said, voice rising with conviction. "It is in the lives you have tried to ruin, the trust you have shattered, the love you sought to manipulate. Justice will not be swayed by title or wealth. It will be guided by truth." Gasps and murmurs filled the room, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Lords and ladies shifted in their seats, unsure of where to place their loyalty, their shock mingling with awe at Clara's courage. Pembroke's face darkened, veins throbbing at his temples, as he realized the strength of the duo he had underestimated. Edward extended his hand to Clara, a silent acknowledgement of partnership, trust, and shared destiny. The gesture spoke louder than any words. The seamstress was no longer beneath him in station, nor was she merely a companion of circumstance. She was his equal, his ally, the woman whose courage had brought justice and redemption to Cavenhurst. Clara took his hand, a spark of warmth traveling through both of them, bridging the distance wrought by weeks of silence and misunderstanding. The ballroom, once a place of whispers and judgment, now bore witness to a new beginning, one forged from honesty, bravery, and the slow, steadfast rise of love reclaimed. The final words were whispered between them, private yet potent. "The first time I caught you," Edward murmured, voice low and intimate. "It was by accident. This time, I choose you." Clara's breath caught, tears threatening to fall, yet she smiled through the tremor. "And I choose you," she replied, the weight of fear and doubt melting into the warmth of resolve and trust. Pembroke, exposed and powerless, could only glare as the room shifted its attention to the Duke and the seamstress, who had defied expectation, scandal, and storm alike. The cold, calculating web he had spun unraveled in moments, leaving him isolated, defeated, and without influence. Outside, the storm began to ease, snowflakes descending in gentle, lazy spirals, rather than the violent assault of hours past. Within the manor, warmth bloomed, literal and figurative, as Edward and Clara stood side by side, hands entwined, hearts mending from past betrayals and the weight of unspoken fears. Every glance they shared, every quiet breath, reinforced the truth. They had survived the darkest hour, confronted lies and danger, and emerged not only unbroken, but stronger together. Their bond, forged in adversity, tempered by honesty and fueled by courage, promised a future unshackled by the past and ready to embrace love, justice, and redemption. And as the ballroom cleared, whispers of awe and admiration lingering in the air, Clara and Edward lingered for a moment longer, savoring the victory not only over Pembroke, but over the shadows that had haunted their hearts. The firelight flickered, casting a golden glow over their joined hands, illuminating faces softened by relief, hope, and the quiet joy of triumph. Clara leaned slightly toward Edward, whispering, "We've reclaimed more than a ball tonight. We've reclaimed ourselves." Edward's grip tightened gently, a silent vow that neither storm, neither lie, nor neither betrayal would ever pull them apart again. And in that moment, amidst the warmth of victory, the embers of love, and the remnants of winter slowly giving way to spring, they allowed themselves to believe in the possibility of forever. The doors of the ballroom closed behind them, sealing the night in memory, and as they stepped into the hall, the quiet certainty settled between them. Together, they could face whatever storms life yet dared to send. And for the first time in many weeks, Edward allowed himself to hope, not just for survival, not just for justice, but for a love that had endured, unyielding and unstoppable. The doors of the winter ball slammed open, gusts of icy wind scattering velvet drapes and crystal shards of candlelight across the polished floors. Edward's jaw clenched, every muscle taut, as he stepped forward, eyes blazing with fury and purpose. Tonight would end the deceit once and for all. Tonight, Pembroke would answer for the web of lies, the whispers, the ruin he had sought to orchestrate. Clara's fingers tightened around Edward's arm, grounding him, reminding him that he did not face this battle alone. Her own heart pounded with equal parts fear and determination. She had risked everything to return, to confront the man who had tormented their lives from the shadows. But now, as they stood together in the grand ballroom, every shimmering chandelier and mirrored wall reflecting their presence, she knew they were ready. The stakes were higher than ever, and the air crackled with tension like the static before a storm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clara's voice rang out, firm and unwavering despite the tremor in her chest. Heads turned, murmurs fluttered like startled birds across the room, and all eyes fixed upon the seamstress who dared to speak truth to power. For too long, you have believed in rumors, in slander, and in the falsehoods of men who seek to destroy what they cannot possess. Tonight, the truth will be revealed. Pembroke stiffened at her words, mask of arrogance faltering. He had expected whispers, scandal, but never confrontation, never the audacity of a woman he had underestimated, nor the unwavering presence of the Duke, standing like a storm incarnate beside her. Edward's gloved hand brushed Clara's, a subtle yet fierce assertion of unity and shared intent. Clara stepped forward, pulling the bundle of evidence from her cloak. Letters, ledgers, and accounts lay sprawled on the polished floor, catching the candlelight and reflecting the gravity of their contents. Every witness could see the proof of Pembroke's manipulations, the tangled lies designed to ruin Edward and tarnish Clara's family name. She spoke clearly, methodically, knowing that every word, every revelation would shift the balance irrevocably. "You have twisted truth into weaponry," Clara continued, voice steady. "Used it to pit hearts against each other, to claim estates, reputations, and lives as if they were yours to command. Edward and I have suffered because of your greed, and yet, here we stand, undaunted, unbroken, and ready to expose your treachery." A hush fell across the ballroom. Even the most scandal-hungry guests, accustomed to whispers of gossip, could not mask their surprise at the seamstress standing so boldly before the assembled nobility. Edward's voice joined hers, resonant and commanding. "Pembroke," he said, eyes cold, cutting through the room like a blade, "you have spent years sowing discord, spinning lies, and destroying trust. The games you played are finished. The Duke of Cavenhurst and Clara Bellamy will no longer be pawns in your scheme." Pembroke's lips twisted into a sneer, but it lacked conviction. "And what proof do you have, Duke?" he demanded, his voice betraying the cracks in his confidence. "What could possibly absolve you in the eyes of those who already condemn you?" Clara lifted a ledger, its leather worn and edges frayed, and laid it open for all to see. The handwriting, the accounts, the unmistakable signatures, they traced every deceit, every manipulated contract, every calculated move meant to ruin them both. "This ledger," she said, eyes flashing, "contains the truth you have tried to hide. Every falsified entry, every forged note, every calculated lie you passed as fact. You sought to destroy us with words. Tonight, the world sees the truth." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs turned to whispers, whispers to astonished chatter. Eyes darted between Edward and Clara, between the evidence and Pembroke's face, which now contorted with the realization of his impending defeat. The air felt electric, each heartbeat loud in the vast expanse of the ballroom. Edward took a deliberate step forward, voice low but sharp enough for Pembroke to hear every syllable. "You underestimated the courage of those you sought to crush. You underestimated the truth, and you underestimated her." He gestured to Clara, whose chin lifted in defiance, eyes unwavering. "Together, we are more than your schemes, more than your lies. Together, we are unbreakable." The crowd leaned in, anticipation hanging like thick velvet. Pembroke's hands twitched, his composure slipping, yet he tried to salvage authority with a harsh laugh. "Bold words for a seamstress and a disgraced duke," he sneered. "Do you truly believe your little collection of papers can undo what society has deemed true for years?" Clara's lips curved in a small, determined smile. "Society has believed your lies for too long," she said. "Truth is not a matter of title or wealth. It is a matter of evidence, of courage, and of integrity. And tonight, it sides with honesty." Edward's gaze hardened. "Let us show them once and for all." Together, they moved through the ballroom, presenting the evidence, detailing every scheme, every act of betrayal. Witnesses gasped as Clara read aloud letters, contracts, and confessions that Pembroke had hoped would remain hidden forever. Edward corroborated every claim with precision, recounting incidents, conversations, and events that left no room for doubt. As the revelations mounted, Pembroke's facade crumbled. His attempts to retort, to dismiss, to twist the narrative faltered against the sheer force of truth, combined with Clara's bravery and Edward's authority. By the time they had finished, the once powerful nobleman stood exposed, powerless, his schemes laid bare for all to see. The ballroom shifted, eyes turning not in judgment of the Duke or the seamstress, but in awe and admiration. Whispers of respect and approval replaced the murmurs of scandal. Edward and Clara stood side by side, a united front, hearts racing with the intensity of victory. Each glance exchanged a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged through peril, pain, and unwavering determination. Then, Edward extended his hand to Clara, a gesture both intimate and public, bridging the gap between social stations, past hurts, and unspoken longing. "The first time I caught you," he murmured, voice low yet carrying across the polished floor, "it was by accident. This time I choose you." Clara's breath caught. The vulnerability she had carried, the fear of rejection, the weight of past sorrow, all melted away in the warmth of his touch, in the certainty of his words. "And I choose you," she whispered back, the room fading around them as the intensity of the moment eclipsed everything else. The crowd, witnessing the moment, could not help but react. Applause, murmurs of approval, and nods of respect rippled outward. Edward and Clara had not only reclaimed their honor, but they had rewritten the rules of engagement in a society bound by gossip and pretense. The seamstress who had once been invisible now stood recognized, respected, and undeniably powerful in her courage. Pembroke, defeated and humiliated, could do nothing but retreat, the full weight of his actions pressing upon him. His influence waned in real time, his schemes undone, his power broken by the very truth he had sought to suppress. The Duke and the seamstress had risen above, not with swords or duels, but with intelligence, bravery, and the courage to face the storm together. Edward's hand remained steady in Clara's, their joined fingers a testament to the battles they had endured and the trust they had rebuilt. Every inch of the ballroom, every reflective surface, echoed their victory, and in that reflection, they saw not just survival, but triumph, connection, and a love that had been tested by betrayal and strengthened by resilience. Clara leaned closer, resting her head against Edward's shoulder for the briefest moment, savoring the warmth, the safety, and the unspoken promise of a future unshackled by lies. "We've faced the storm," she murmured, voice soft yet confident, "and we've won." Edward's lips brushed her hair in a silent affirmation. "The storm outside and within, it does not frighten me anymore, because we face it together." As the night drew on, the ballroom emptied of those who had witnessed the confrontation, leaving only Edward and Clara in the glow of the remaining candles. The firelight danced across their faces, casting shadows and warmth in equal measure. In that intimacy, they found not only victory, but healing, the quiet understanding that love, trust, and courage had triumphed over deceit and fear. Every glance they shared, every brush of fingers, every subtle smile reinforced the certainty. Their lives, intertwined through fate, peril, and resolve, would no longer be dictated by the whispers of society or the schemes of men like Pembroke. Together, they had reclaimed not just a ballroom, not just a title, not just a reputation. They had reclaimed themselves. Edward, finally allowing a deep breath, stepped back slightly, taking in the woman who had risked everything to stand here with him. "You were fearless," he said, awe threading his voice. "Fearless and brilliant. I could not have done this without you." Clara's eyes glistened. "Neither could I," she replied, "and we won't face anything without each other, ever again." The storm outside had subsided, leaving a blanket of snow glistening under the first moonlight of dawn. Inside, warmth, justice, and love radiated, mingling with the residual tension of confrontation and the quiet triumph of truth. Edward and Clara stood at the center of the ballroom, hands intertwined, hearts aligned, fully aware that the darkest trials had passed and a new beginning stretched before them. And as the first soft notes of spring crept into the air, Edward whispered, "This is only the beginning. We've reclaimed the night, the truth, and each other. Let the world see it now." Clara smiled, head resting lightly against his shoulder, every worry, every fear, every moment of doubt dissipating in the warmth of their shared victory. "Let them," she said, "and let us never forget what courage and love can achieve." Together they turned toward the windows, the moonlight reflecting off the snow and the polished floor, shining on the Duke and the seamstress who had faced the storm and emerged unbroken, triumphant, and inseparable. The winter ball, once a place of fear and scandal, had been reclaimed as a monument to courage, truth, and the undeniable power of love. The first warm breeze of spring swept through Cavenhurst Manor, carrying the scent of thawing earth and blooming lilacs, and Clara felt it as a shock to her chest, a reminder that winter's harsh grip had finally released them. Her hands, once trembling over thread and needle in dim London lamplight, now rested steady on the sewing table in her bright new workshop at the manor's edge. The village girls around her chattered with excitement, their small fingers fumbling with fabric scraps, eyes wide with curiosity and awe. Yet Clara's mind remained anchored, heart pounding, in the memory of the last snowstorm, the confrontation, the triumph, the revelation, and the man whose presence had become both her anchor and her fire. Edward's voice broke her reverie. "Clara." She looked up to see him standing in the doorway, sunlight glinting off the golden embroidery of his coat, hair slightly mussed, eyes still carrying that stormy intensity she had learned to crave. He had a letter in one hand, a small parcel in the other, but it was the unspoken weight behind his gaze that stopped her breath. "I thought I'd find you here." She rose, heart thundering in a mixture of nerves and anticipation. "And did you?" she asked, masking the tremor in her voice with a smile. Edward stepped fully into the room, closing the distance between them. "I did, because this—" He gestured around the bright workshop, to the eager girls and the vibrant fabrics, to the life she had carved out for herself. "This is exactly where you belong, and I couldn't let another moment pass without being here." Clara's chest tightened. "You've been here all along, Edward, in my thoughts, in every thread I sew." He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, his gloved hand warm against her cheek. "And I will be, every day. No more storms between us, no more secrets, only this, only us." The intensity of his words, the raw sincerity, cut through the lingering shadows of fear she still carried. She had faced scandal, betrayal, and heartbreak, and yet, here he was, offering her not just protection, but partnership, equality, and love. Clara swallowed hard, letting the weight of that realization settle. She had dreamed of safety, but what she craved more was courage, the courage to accept joy, to embrace love, to step fully into life again. The sound of laughter drew their attention. The village girls had begun pairing off, practicing stitches and patterns, their small fingers guided by Clara's patient hands. Each one reminded her of the freedom she had fought for, the chance to teach, to create, and to be seen. Her gaze met Edward's again, and in that moment, She understood that their winter of trials had forged something stronger than fear: trust. "Shall we?" Edward asked softly, holding out his hand. Clara placed hers in his, feeling the familiar spark, the electric recognition of two souls who had collided, fallen, and risen together. They stepped outside onto the garden terrace, the soft green shoots pushing through the melting snow, reflecting their own renewal. The manor, once imposing and cold, seemed to sigh in relief, its windows catching sunlight like eyes opening to a new day. Edward led her along the winding path toward the willow grove. "Do you remember," he asked, voice low and almost reverent, "the first time we truly looked at each other, not as Duke and seamstress, not as scandal and rumor, but as two people bound by fate?" Clara nodded, remembering the icy ballroom, the slip, the moment their eyes had met and everything shifted. "I remember feeling both terrified and strangely safe, as if the world could fall apart around me and you would be the one to catch me." He smiled, a rare, unguarded expression that softened the stern lines of his face. "And I did, though I was more frightened than you knew, afraid I'd fail, afraid I'd lose you before I even had the chance to prove I was worthy." Clara watched them, heart swelling. Every stitch she had sewn, every risk she had taken, every tear and sleepless night had led to this, a life brimming with purpose, with love, and with the certainty of belonging. Edward kissed her hand, lingering, savoring the warmth and the pulse of life flowing between them. "We've fought for this, Clara. We've bled for it. But here, now, it is ours." She smiled, finally allowing herself to exhale fully, the weight of the past lifting with each heartbeat. "Ours," she echoed, and in that single word there was triumph, peace, and the first whisper of forever. Together they wandered the blooming gardens, sharing quiet confidences, laughter, and moments of gentle intimacy. Clara pointed out the first buds of lilac, Edward noted the returning songbirds, and in each observation, each shared glance, the ordinary became extraordinary. Their love, forged in snow and hardship, now flourished in light and renewal. As the sun climbed higher, casting gold across the manor's spires and the glistening garden paths, Edward pulled Clara to a quiet bench beneath the willow. They sat, fingers intertwined, watching the world awaken around them. "You've given me more than I could have ever imagined," Edward murmured, voice thick with emotion. "Not just love, not just trust, but the courage to believe in life again." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, warmth spreading through her like sunlight. "And you've given me hope, Edward. Hope that the heart can heal, that the past does not have to define us, and that love, true love, is worth every risk." He kissed the top of her head, a soft promise lingering in the spring air. "Then let us never forget the storms we've weathered. Let them remind us that we are strong, together, and unyielding." The manor behind them hummed with renewed life, servants tending to new tasks, girls laughing as they learned to sew, and the land itself awakening from the long, harsh winter. Yet the most significant transformation had occurred in the hearts of two people who had endured everything society and fate could throw at them. Edward and Clara remained beneath the willow, the blossoms swaying gently around them, the breeze carrying the promise of growth, renewal, and shared life. Each breath they took together reinforced their bond, each heartbeat synchronized with the certainty that whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them as one. "I think," Clara whispered, eyes shining, "that this is what it means to be truly alive, to love fully, to forgive completely, to hold nothing back." Edward pressed a tender kiss to her lips, slow and deliberate. "Alive indeed, and together, always." The willow's branches swayed, soft shadows dancing across their faces, And in the spring sunlight, Cavenhurst Manor stood not as a monument to wealth or title, but as a symbol of resilience, redemption, and love reclaimed. Clara and Edward had survived winter's cruelest tests and emerged into a season of warmth, growth, and infinite possibility. As they rose to walk back to the manor, hand in hand, Clara felt a serenity she had never known. She had faced betrayal, heartbreak, and fear, yet here she was, fully seen, fully loved, and fully alive. Edward's presence beside her was no longer a shadow or a challenge, but a constant, unwavering source of strength and devotion. The snow had melted, the frost had receded, and in its place, love, patient, enduring, and victorious, had taken root, promising a lifetime of shared sunrises, laughter, and quiet, unshakable joy. Together they entered the manor, ready to face the future, knowing that spring at Cavenhurst was more than a season. It was a testament to courage, to truth, and to the enduring power of hearts brave enough to love.